Well, hi everyone. Kim Parr from the Crocker House Museum in Mount Clemens, Michigan, helping you get through this COVID-19 scare while you're isolated at home. I thought probably the most pertinent thing to talk about is food and how our historical ancestors dealt with food issues. I just came from Myers and it's a madhouse. And as you know, there's a scarcity on toilet paper. But think about it. Did the Crocker family here have toilet paper? Probably in the early days, no. They used corn cobs. They maybe had their catalogs to use, but corn cobs were the typical thing to use. And daily they would do a sponge bath, most people. Full bath, usually just once a week on a Saturday. So did they have paper towels? No, they used regular towels. We're such a disposable society today, if you think about it. We really are spoiled. Probably the biggest thing that would have been a huge improvement in their lives was having running water in the house. And even when this house was built 150 years ago, they had to heat the water here on the stove. So we do take a lot of things for granted, and with the way things are going, we're going to have to get back to some of those old-fashioned ways of dealing with food and cleanliness and that. A lot of people today, they think that most people had meat on their plate every day, our ancestors, and that's really not true. They had 2 butchering times a year typically. So you would wait for your largest butchering once you had really cold temperatures and hopefully some snow to help preserve the meat while you're preserving meat in methods such as using salt with a sugar and spice type of brine that you would put around your meat. You would also put it in crocks, your smaller pieces, and the first thing they'd eat would be the tenderloin. So to put moisture back into those meats, they would have to, especially if it's a large piece of meat like a ham, you would have to soak it for a couple of days anyway, rinsing it a couple times at least a day, and allowing the moisture to get back into the meat and to pull the salt out. When I went to the store the other day, I couldn't find eggs. And so we're also very spoiled at having eggs. But historically, before we had these mega farms with lights on the chickens, you really didn't have an abundance of eggs until spring. When the sun starts shining for a longer period of time, the hens start to say, hey, it's time to lay eggs. And in the springtime, they would have so many eggs that they would, well, you can look through cookbooks and find recipes for cakes with a dozen eggs in them, quiche recipes, lots and lots of different egg recipes. But you also find recipes for no egg cake and recipes that no egg this, no egg that. And so that goes to tell you that during the winter months, they dealt with not having really many fresh eggs. But there's one thing that they would do when they had an abundance of eggs to preserve them. And they would take an egg and they would permeate it in a beeswax. And that would permeate any air from getting into the egg to rot it. It's really the air that would cause anything to rot. So you permeate the egg, dipping it into beeswax, and you would put it in a crock full of oats, layering it between layers of oats. And I don't know if you know this, but I used to work at Greenville Village at Henry Ford Museum. I was there for just about 10 years, and I was a lead of domestic living history programs. So it was a great learning experience because I did farming from 1750s on up to turn of the century, primarily the Daggett farm and the Firestone farm. So that was 1750s and 1880s primarily. A big difference between those two eras, huge differences. 1750s, you didn't have canning yet. So what we take for granted today of buying canned goods, think about it. Those people didn't have it. Canning really didn't come available until Napoleon had commissioned a chef to come up with ways to preserve food for his troops. So thank you, Napoleon. And then, of course, that method was perfected. So what did they do? They dried vegetables. Certain things dry better than others. They could pickle things, pickling and drying. That's pretty much what they did. They'd string up apple and pumpkin and outside and dry it. And we did this technique at the Daggett farm, and we would make pumpkin soup out of dried pumpkin. We'd make apple pie out of dried apples. So think about that when you're shopping. Think about things that our ancestors used that had prolonged shelf life. Raisins. Funeral pie, as it was known, was a raisin pie. And that's because you always had raisins on your shelf. They have a long shelf life. So that's another good thing to have on hand. And that's why you've seen it more prevalently in recipes, in historical cookbook recipes, because you always had raisins on your shelf and it was easy to throw in many different things. Even sandwiches, they would soak raisins in brandy and have raisin sandwiches. Does that sound good? Hey, give it a try. I was just pulling out some of these recipes. This just gives you an idea. Omelets galore for springtime. Of course, we're dealing with a shortage on eggs. Hopefully, that's short-lived, and we'll have plenty of eggs coming in. But I was just going through here. The other thing that's interesting in historical cookbooks, I don't know if I grabbed the right. Well, this is just to show you about the egg thing. 2-egg pound cake. Pound cakes typically have a lot of eggs in them. 1-egg cake, and I know there were a lot of recipes for no egg, this and that. So that's kind of interesting just to point out. Mock recipes. Mock turtle soup, because they didn't have the turtle. I found one in here. Oh, I think I have the wrong book. Isn't this a wonderful book? This is in our collection. If any of you knew Paul Sonnenberg, he was a past president here. And that sweet man donated his house and everything in it to our society. It took me a year to go through his house. And I was very careful to keep everything that we could that was historical. And this came from his family, all handwritten. All these recipes are handwritten. But I had found an interesting recipe in here, and of course, where is it? There was an interesting, it was mock Indian pudding. There it is. Mock Indian pudding. Indian pudding was popular. It was made from cornmeal. And of course, cornmeal is something that keeps on your shelf for a long time too. But mock Indian pudding, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, no corn in it. It has 1/4 cup of molasses, 1 egg, 2 tablespoons of molasses mixed well together, and stir into 1 pint of boiling milk. Boil 6 minutes. Add salt, a small amount of nutmeg, and a large piece of butter. Yes, this is how they wrote recipes. We have Fanny Farmer to thank for the standardized measurements. She just happened to be writing her book at the right time because of the World's Fair at that time. Manufacturers were manufacturing all types of things, and they came out with a standardized measurement cup and measurement spoons. And so she was the first, Fanny Farmer, to write a book that used these standardized measurements. And so that's when people started, buying these standardized cups and tablespoons and teaspoons and so forth. But here, it's a large piece of butter. Now, a large piece of butter could mean different things to different people, right? Okay, well, and also there's cream, and that's it. There's no corn. Isn't that interesting? There's not even any flour in it. I'm telling you, our ancestors were very creative. They came up with ways of making things without. They were used to being without. And probably some of you folks that are my age or older that had parents or grandparents that came out of the Depression, guess what? We can relate now, can't we? I remember my grandparents had all kinds of stuff in their pantry. In fact, when they passed away, I cleaned out their pantry and it had a lot of canned goods that went bad. They always kept stocked, and that's because they were survivors of the Depression. And too bad we didn't listen too much to them, to take heed to their advice. And now we are really going to live life differently after this COVID-19. The other thing I was talking about was meat. So our ancestors went with the flow. Once their gardens start producing, they're not going to be eating as much meat. Certainly not every day. They may have some salt pork to flavor some vegetables in that, but having a steak and, what a lot of people are used to today, they didn't have. They ate up what was coming up from their gardens, and they had to cook it up before it went to waste, of course, in their busy canning. But there were vegetarians, folks. I'm one of them, and I've been for like close to 30 years. So you can live without meat. This is a naturopath vegetarian cookbook from the turn of the century. And it's really interesting to read because, and give you some ideas, because they would cook down things like lentils and make a spread for sandwiches. Let me see if I can pull up a few things. Now, mind you, this is not a vegan diet, because you'll still see sometimes some eggs and some milk and some of those animal products. But here, lentil cutlets, macaroni cutlets, oyster plant. That is a very interesting plant. And you see a lot of recipes for that. If you're not familiar with it, it's a rooted vegetable that kind of looks like a parsnip, but the exterior of it is black. The inside of the root is white. And as you peel it, you need to have some salted water that you put it into, because you'll peel it to reveal the white, and it will slowly become black again on the outside of it. Bizarre plant. It really does taste like oysters. I've had it. We used to grow it, and I actually like it. We would saute it with other vegetables. Really, it's really good. I like it. I wanted to point out a couple other things. They used a lot of oats and barley and things like that. Well, anyway, I hope I just encouraged you to think about dried foods. We are at an advantage of having canned foods and having freezers, of course. But dried foods they have a long shelf life. So I would really consider stocking up on dried goods. And with your creativity and looking at some old cookbooks, you'll get some really good ideas. So folks, hang in there. We're going to get through this. Our ancestors did, and so will we. We just have to be smarter and not so wasteful. Is this our planet getting back to us? They're saying that this COVID-19 has sprung from the Asian wet markets, and these are meat markets full of wild animals, and it's unnatural to have such a mixture of wild animals together that their immune systems become low because they're freaked out in these horrid, wretched, nightmarish places. And it was really the food handlers, the handlers of these animals, who tortured and killed them. Sorry. Don't mean to offend carnivores, but a lot of unnatural type of mixture of animals together, bats and snakes and all kinds of things, foxes and wild cats and you name it. If you watch 60 Minutes, they just had something on it. We have to be very careful and really care for our environment. And our ancestors worked the ground and they preserved food, and we need to get back to that. So everybody take care, stock up on your dried goods, and stay healthy. And we greatly look forward to seeing you healthy and happy once this is over back here at the Crocker House Museum.